Hello and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm writer and exhausted dad of two, Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and shockingly well-rested, Julia Hall.
And today, for our 6th season, we're looking at The Eyes of Tammy Faye, the 2021 biopic about Tammy Faye Bakker, played by Jessica Chastain. We'll be asking, where did televangelism come from? What is the prosperity gospel? And what can we learn from the way Tammy Faye treated people with AIDS? Julia, I introduced you to this film for the podcast. What did you think of it?
I really liked it. I liked it more than I thought I would. I tend to watch films in chunks. So I'll watch like 40 minutes and then I'll stop and watch something else. It drives my fiance nuts. He's like, why can't you sit down and watch a whole film? But I watched Tammy Faye in 2 chunks, but only because I had to go to work the next day. But it had me absolutely hooked in a way that I did not expect.
That's awesome. Yeah, I discovered it when it came out, and when you're listening to podcasts and then for some reason all three different completely different podcasts that you're listening to all seem to be focusing on the same thing. So it just drew my attention to it. So without further ado, let's hear Julia's facts.
I've got a few facts. Some of them I think are quite fun, quite juicy. So we'll start with the sort of beginning stuff. But obviously this film was made in 2021, but it was based on the 2000 documentary of the same name, which was actually narrated by RuPaul. I did some digging on this, and Randy Barbato, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Fenton Bailey, who produced the documentary, actually went on to start Drag Race, RuPaul's Drag Race, in 2009, which I thought was very interesting because I knew that Tammy Faye was obviously very influential in the LGBTQ plus community, but I didn't actually know the connection with RuPaul there. And she was on the RuPaul show as well at some point in the late 90s, I believe. Jessica Chastain watched the documentary during her press tour on Zero Dark 30, and she loved it so much that she knew that she wanted to make it into a biopic, and she got the rights for it in 2012. So just under a decade later, she was actually able to make it. Chastain also did all of her own singing for the movie, which I think is extremely impressive. She described it as, quote, stressful and, quote, uncomfortable, which I fully get.
Stressful and uncomfortable is a 2-word review for Zero Dark 30 as well. I can't think of 2 films that are more diametrically opposed in any way, shape or form. That's awesome.
And her voice was not the only thing that she had to kind of drastically transform for the movie. The prosthetics as well that she wore to transform into Tammy Faye were pretty extensive. So the shortest amount of time it took to put on, and this is things like, so you've got silicone cheeks and chin and nose tape. Later on there's like neck and bodysuits and stuff. The shortest time, the least amount of time, is 3.5 hours, but including makeup and hair and costume, sometimes it could take up to 7 hours, which is absolutely wild to me. Unsurprisingly, it did get an Oscar and a BAFTA as well for makeup and hair, I believe, possibly as well, but definitely for makeup.
Yeah, I'm trying to describe the way I feel about the makeup in this. Is terrifying the right word to use?
Yeah, I think I do know what you mean. It's uncanny. The resemblance is, you can I think in the earlier scenes when she's a lot younger, you can see a lot more of Chastain in them, but as the prosthetics kind of layer up, she's Tammy. She is Tammy Faye. The transformation is incredible. Even with the mascara and the tattooed eyeliner on later. And while Chastain was researching for the movie, there's that image, when you think of Tammy Faye, you often think of this very kind of overly emotional woman with sort of mascara all running down her face. But actually, Tammy Faye's mascara never ran because she always wore waterproof. And these kind of drippy mascaras, sort of caricatures, were only actually from comedy sketch shows. Chastain mentioned that when she thought of Tammy Faye, she could seem to remember a lot of this mascara running as a theme, but actually that never happened to the real Tammy Faye, because she was prepared and she always wore waterproof eyeliner. Smart girl.
Damn right. I love that. It's really interesting, that, isn't it? When something you start to see in parody becomes so associated with the original thing.
And I think especially she was vilified and made fun of and parodied a lot in her life. It is, I suppose, unfortunate in a way that an element of when we think of Tammy Faye and we think of that image that's not really her, it's a kind of almost like a Mandela effect of of who she actually was.
Definitely.
It wasn't just, I've spoken a lot about Jessica Chastain, but Andrew Garfield as well did a lot of research for the film, and both him and Chastain actually went to Sunday service while they were shooting the film at a place called Morningside Church in South Carolina, which is on the site or near Heritage USA, which was like the big kind of...
The theme park.
The theme park, which I thought, I mean, that's dedication. They would grab Starbucks and then they'd go to Sunday service at this church, but it also meant that they could talk to people who also knew Tammy Faye in a much closer proximity. Yeah, but I think that's dedication.
Definitely.
Dedication.
I'll be honest with you, I was less impressed with Andrew Garfield's old man makeup.
Yes, actually.
It reminded me a little too much of Ant and Dec's Friday Night Takeaway, or whatever it was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do wonder if they spent all the budget on Jessica Chastain and went, oh. And Andrew Garfield went, so what am I getting? And they went, oh, man.
Get the work experience kid in.
Get the intern.
Let him just slap on a bit of silicone there. Let's just see what happens. There is one moment when Tammy Faye is in the prison as she's talking to Jim on the other side. And it would not have been out of place for Batman to come out from behind her, just start like beating her for information. She does look like a ginger version of the Joker at some point.
Yeah, it's extreme, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much rubber on there. It looks like she looks like a Jim Henson character at one point.
What, a Statler and Waldorf? Is that with the very pronounced kind of nose and chin and cheeks?
Yeah.
Though, speaking of, there's a little bit at the end, near the end of the film, where a few of her neighbours, the teenage boys, and they're kind of talking about her and saying, oh, freak, there she is. I told her that she lives here. And she go over and she says, you can talk about me as much as you want, but you've got to say hi to me first.
I loved that bit. That was one of my favourite bits.
I love that too. But apparently, according to her son Jay, this is based on not a singular real event, but something that happened quite often with Tammy. I read in an article, quote, Jay remembers going to a Palm Desert mall with his mother and inevitably seeing kids wearing I Ran Into Tammy shirts, novelty tees where the text is accompanied by a splatter of makeup. What she would actually do is go up and ask if they were hungry, says Jay. His mother would then march the kids over to the Marie calendars and pay for whatever they wanted to order. She'd say, you can get whatever you want, and then we'll just sit and talk. And I think that's lovely.
Gosh, that's something else, isn't it?
I think that's her in a nutshell. I think if you asked me to explain Tammy Faye to you in one story, in one kind of anecdote, that's, I think, maybe up there with what really encompassed her as a person.
Yeah, 100%. Just the way that somebody's criticising you and you know somebody's treating you like a joke, and then to go up and like deliberately try and make friends with them, basically.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of guts. A lot of guts. That's all of my facts.
Those facts were wonderful, Julia. Thank you so very much.
Hi guys, it's Claire. Just popping in to say you should definitely check out our Patreon page. If you head to www.patreon.com/godinfilmpodcast, you'll find loads of bonus content such as extended interviews, extra little bits that didn't quite make it into the episode, as well as exclusive patrons-only episodes, like our Godin Gaming episode. Plus, if you sign up to our Bishop Waller Bridge tier, you'll get to hear episodes in advance, like our episode on The Fablemans right now. So why not give it a try? And if that's not doable, did you know you can help the podcast for free by writing us a review, giving us a shout out on social media, or just telling a friend about us? And now, back to the show.
Okay, for this next section, for our next guest, we've got somebody returning to the podcast, somebody who is an absolute expert in pretty much any film we can ask him about. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name's Andy Godfrey. I live in Milton Keynes. I'm a full-time evangelist working with an organisation called Outreach UK, so I spend my days trying to tell people about Jesus. I also am a film critic. I run the Mark Kermode Appreciation Society. I write for Sorted magazine, and I review films on Connect Radio. So that's a little bit about me.
Andy, thank you so much. It's such a joy to have you back on the show. I think last episode we had you on was last year for Blade Runner, and that is like one of our most popular episodes ever. So I think you can take some credit for that.
Well, that's lovely to hear.
So,
I mean, Blade Runner we'll talk about till the cows come home.
So obviously we're here to talk about The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the film?
The Eyes of Tammy Faye, Giles, came out in 2021. It's a biographical drama directed by Michael Showalter, and it's actually based on a screenplay which was based on a documentary. The documentary had the same name. We have the story of Tammy Faye and Jim Bakker, who get married, who they fall in love. They meet at theological college. They fall in love. They start a television career preaching, one of these televangelists, and eventually they face a downfall. It's a really fascinating story of a television evangelist and his wife who start out with really great intentions and then end up, well, in fact, Jim ended up in prison for 6 months and eventually was outed as being gay. So this is a really interesting story. We follow the two central characters on a journey, an incredible journey, really, and get a little bit of an insight into what was actually going on.
It's interesting that you talk about how their motivations start off pure, and you can start to see a little bit of a degradation of that as we go along. I think often these guys get linked in with, we're talking about the prosperity gospel, don't they?
Yes.
And that sort of starts to impact their motivations. How would you define prosperity gospel?
Okay, so prosperity gospel are people who stand up and say, if you believe in God, God will give you everything you want. But you can literally ask God for a Ferrari and a Ferrari will turn up. They believe that if you ask God for money, he will provide you with more than you need. It's this kind of teaching that says, because you are on God's side, God is now on yours, which I agree with. God will do whatever you ask of him. A lot of these televangelists in America, I remember having a holiday to Florida some years ago. We took my daughter to Disney World and I was watching some of them on TV. And they're literally just saying, trust in God, believe in Jesus, believe in the Bible, name it and claim it. You can have anything you want. This is really the road that they started to go down. Although, as we've just said, I think that they started out really good. And I think their motivations at the beginning were quite pure, were quite good. They just slowly got drawn into this world. As they began to get more famous, as they began to get more money, as they began to live in bigger homes, as they began to drive bigger cars, they needed to pay for all that. And so they started this television ministry. I mean, there are television evangelists in America who say, if you send me $1,000, I will pray for you. You've got people that are gullible enough to pray to do this. I saw one televangelist, Giles, who said, if you send me $1,000, I'll pray for you every day for a month. And I'll pray 3 things. I'll pray for your health, I'll pray for your social life, and I'll pray for your wealth. And I remember thinking, if I send you $1,000, mate, you better be praying for my wealth. Because, it's just ridiculous. And I think what happened with Tammy and Jim Bakker was that they began to meet other televangelists. They began to move in those sort of circles. And they just began to get ambitions above their station. And they wanted more and more and more money, more and more physical. But there was one point they were talking about opening a spiritual theme park. I mean, don't ask me what the rides would have been. Step inside the whale and have a whale of a time.
I think it ended up being like one of the most popular theme parks for Christians in America.
Yeah. And, I mean, there's a great quote near the start of the film where she says to him, when he tells her that he's in love with her, they want to get married. And she says to him, and he says he's going to be a preacher. And her words are these. She says, there are words and then there's the word, referring obviously to the Bible. So they start off with the best of intentions. They want to tell people that there is a God. They want to tell people that God sent his son and his son's name was Jesus and that Jesus died on the cross and Jesus rose again. But as their ministry begins to grow, as they begin to see more and more money coming in, and, I just think that they just fall. They just become so greedy. He ends up defrauding the American tax office, gets sent to prison for 5 years. She tried to carry on the ministry while he was in prison. But there was this gradual decline. And it's kind of the old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely,
Yeah.
And the love of money, as Paul says, is the root of all evil,
Yeah.
I think that we've got a classic example of that in Tammy and Jim Bakker. And the film, I think the film's a very powerful film. I thought the film was a really well made. So to see these two, to learn a little bit about where they came from, learn about their background, but then see this gradual decline, it's really eye-opening.
What would you say has been like the lasting legacy of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker?
Do you know what? I'm not really sure, because I think the real thing has been to make us all the more cautious of these televangelists. Who do we trust? Who do we believe? You need to check people out before you start sending money to them, particularly.
Yeah.
I mean, that should go without saying, where is my money going? And I just think that the legacy it's a warning to us all. Be careful who you listen to, be careful who you trust, because there might be a snake in their garden, and we just don't know sometimes whether we can trust these people or not. I mean, some people who appear very renowned and very good on the Bible and what I would call solid on the Bible, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, have proved to be deceptive. They proved to be in it for their own ends. So I would say don't trust everything you see on TV is actually the main legacy that we've got from these two.
I think it's made Christians in media in general be very wary and made us very much aware that there's certain routes you shouldn't go down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Not to fall into that kind of cult of celebrity.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in recent years, we've obviously lost Dr. Billy Graham. We've lost Louis Pallow. I haven't seen God bringing in a replacement for those two in terms of an internationally known worldwide preacher that everybody can talk about and everybody flocks to, And I just wonder with the demise of those two in particular, if God isn't doing something new in our day and age, where he's saying, I'm not going to send you people like that anymore. Get on with it yourselves for your own local business, And I, for one, was very glad that the film was a success. I've got to be honest, because I think we forget that Jessica Chastain, she won the Oscar for Best Actress.
She was one of the producers for it
as well, wasn't she? As well. The film won Oscars for Best Actress, Best Makeup, and Best Hairstyling.
Yeah, that's quite an odd compliment, because her hairstyles and her makeup are absolutely horrendous.
They are. It's awful. Right from that very first shot where you got the close-up of her eyes and she's applying mascara around her eyes. She needed to look good. I was thinking of the line in Back to the Future, where Marty's back in the 50s and Doc says, who's your president? Says Ronald Reagan. And he says, no wonder your president has to be an actor. He's got to look good on TV. I was thinking of that line when I was thinking about the film again this afternoon. These two look good on TV.
Yeah.
They really did. They were appealing. They went out amongst the audience. They sat and chatted to apparently ordinary people, backed each other up. You'd have thought they were the most happily married people in the world.
Yeah.
They had every reason to be, because they had every luxury that this world affords. But they got it through defrauding people tact. They got it through cheating. They got it through lying, and they slowly fell. And there's a character in that Paul talks about in one of his letters in the Bible where he says, so I forget the guy's name off the top of my head, so and so has deserted me for the love of money. And that's in one of Paul's letters. He names a character and he says that this guy has deserted me for the love of money. And that kind of sums up, I think, a lot of these televangelists, that the love of money has replaced the love of God and the love of preaching the word of God. And Jim Bakker was a great preacher. I mean, those early scenes where he's out preaching, I go out preaching quite a lot, as you know, and those early scenes when he's out preaching are brilliant, and you just see a guy who's impassioned and full of the love of God and just wanting to share what the Bible has to say. But as things go on, there is this gradual decline. I thought the film was very entertaining. I know a lot of people who aren't Christians who saw it and enjoyed it. I don't think it did our cause any good. Who genuinely want to preach the gospel.
When people first hear the word evangelist, they think of these kind of guys. It doesn't make your job any easier.
No, it doesn't. And I get churches all the time very kindly book me up to preach, and they say, well, what shall we give you in terms of money or whatever? To which my reply is always, well, it's up to you.
Yeah.
You know how far I'm traveling, you know the price of petrol, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, it's up to you. I'm not going to charge for my services of preaching the gospel. But what happened was that these two I think they did become over ambitious. I thought they felt they could achieve more, than they could. It's almost interesting as well. There's a scene in the film where they're having a meal with other televangelists of the time. And it's almost like there's a bit of competition going on. My audience is bigger than yours. Well, my program brings in more money than yours. Well, I've had more souls saved than you, And I get a lot of in conferences where there's a lot of evangelists. And if we all sat around saying, right, I've had more souls saved than you, and 54 people came to my meeting last week. A dreadful situation. But this was going on. And it's very clear this was going on behind the scenes. So I just feel that the film tells the story very well indeed. And certainly, I think Jessica Chastain in the lead role, she deserved her Oscar because I think she absolutely sells that role with total conviction. And of the two, you get the impression from the film that she was the one who was most hesitant about the danger. She could see what was beginning to happen. And kind of reluctantly went along with it. Whereas Jim was saying, well, look, if we get more money, we can do this, this, and this. And she was kind of trying to hold him back a little bit, one gets the impression. But she obviously couldn't, and he obviously did end up in prison.
Yeah. Listen, Andy, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It's such a joy to hear just somebody with just this expert level of knowledge about any film that we ask you about.
It's all in the research, Charles.
So, Julia, that was Andy Godfrey. What did you think?
Wow, I mean, when you told me that he knew his stuff, I mean, he really does know his stuff, doesn't he?
Yeah, 100%. Do you know what was interesting was Andy sits right in the middle of a very interesting Venn diagram of being film critic and evangelistic preacher. Do you know what I mean?
It's quite a resume. When I heard that, I was, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect a combination to work, but it absolutely does.
I don't think I could have picked anyone better to talk about this particular one. And what I thought was really, really interesting was when he hit upon was effectively when churches want to give him money for his services, for giving a sermon. This is one of those really weird areas where if you could do it for free, you probably would.
Yeah.
And you can't say, well, like, it's not like you can give them a price list and say, well, for this I do X, Y, and Z. And that really bizarre relationship, because as we'll get into this later, when it comes to sort of Christianity and money, there's no easy answers a lot of the time,
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film.
Ba-ba!
Okay, so we've got a lot of chewy stuff to get through here.
I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, some stuff which is like fine-tuned for Julia enjoyment, and I think everybody else will quite like it as well. First of all, we're going to ask, where did televangelism come from? And I think you and me are both on the same page that when you hear the word televangelist, it feels a bit cringe. It feels a little bit
it feels a bit
slimy.
Yeah, a very not Christian, I think, in some ways, but. Yeah, it just, I don't know, it always seems very exploitative to me. And I think before I watched this film, what I love about this film is that it simultaneously shows you the absolute best of televangelism about what it should be, and the absolute worst of televangelism.
Yeah.
Which I think this comes with a lot of the more sort of negative of sides of any organised religion. That always tends to be the slightly more vocal, the thing that you come away with the most sometimes. It always seems to be, it's like, so when I'm at school, I could have 5 really nice positive interactions with my students that day, and I could have one really awful one. And the awful one, it sticks with you a lot more. And definitely. You wish that it didn't, but it absolutely does. And I think the same can very much be said when we think of televangelism. We think of the Jim Bakker side and the sort of very negative, greedy, grasping kind of side, rather than the side that it should be, which I suppose is the Tammy Faye side, right?
Yeah, 100%. So televangelism is a predominantly American phenomenon, and it can find its roots going like all the way back to the 1930s in radio. Okay, so radio had Christian ministers speaking on them right back to like 1923, and like everything else back then, radio was a heavily segregated medium. So whilst white preachers are on radio, black preachers are like shuffled out, and they're actually recording their sermons on vinyl and selling them, and they're being sold in record shops like you'd have music or comedy records at the time. And what they start to notice was that the more excitable, more flamboyant, more charismatic sermons tend to sell better than some of the more dusty, dry academic sermons. So it's impossible to say exactly what came from where, but this need to make sermons exciting and urgent bleeds into the mainstream Christian speakers on radio. Okay, so Christian media begins to transition from radio to television in the 1950s, and at that point we begin to see the emergence of some of the characters that turn up in this film. So like Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcast Network is founded in 1961, and then other evangelists come up this time, like Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart, Jim and Tammy Faye, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson. Just side point, Vincent D'Onofrio as Jerry Falwell. Was it just me, or was he scarier in this than he was as Kingpin?
Yeah, I think there was such a quiet menace to him. Weirdly, yeah, especially when the scene where they're in the car and they're sort of scouting out the site for Heritage USA, and he's talking with Jim about backing the right presidency and all this other sort of political stuff, and Tammy sort of leans forward a bit and goes, "Look, can we maybe keep politics out of the church?" And he shuts that down like immediately. Ooh,
100%.
Bad feeling. Ooh.
Like the Jerry Falwell and Kingpin thing reminds me of like Voldemort and Dolores Umbridge, because Voldemort and Kingpin are the kind of sneering, evil, twisted villains that you're never really going to see in real life, but everybody's flipping met a Dolores Umbridge in their time. Everybody's met like a Jerry Falwell kind of character. So another famous evangelist that turns up in this time is Billy Graham. Have you ever heard of that guy?
No, I don't think I've come across him before.
So he is like this world famous preacher. Believe it or not, he turns up in season 2 of The Crown. He preaches.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I have watched The Crown, so I may have seen him and then forgotten all about him.
So Billy Graham is one of these. He's really interesting. He starts off as very socially conservative, and then over time he kind of gets more liberal and changes his mind on like some of the racial politics. He was basically like pastor to the presidents, to pretty much every president that was around from
see, this is ringing a bell. I think with some. It's been a while since I watched season 2 of The Crown, but it's some of it's coming back to me, I think, yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, like, not all evangelists are terrible.
Yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
a given. Billy Graham led these massive missions over in the States and also over here. And I can kind of trace, like a lot of people, I can kind of trace my spiritual heritage back to Billy Graham, because the person who was preaching the night I became a Christian at a Billy Graham event, and because he had such an impact, there's probably a lot of people who can trace back to him that way. So, but as well as he's known mainly for being like a touring evangelist, a lot of his sermons are televised and put on radio. So that gives you like a very brief overview of how it comes about. Now, some basic observations about the sort of style of the evangelism can be drawn out here. A lot of televangelists are non-denominational. When I say denominational, do you know what that means?
Is this so the type of Christian that you are? So Catholic or Protestant or Baptist or Presbyterian or something?
Yeah, that's the general.
Right
the general gist. Broadly speaking, Catholicism sort of comes around after like I think it's the 3rd century. Everybody gets together and says, okay, well, what do we believe? What should we put in the Bible? What should we throw out? Well, do you guys actually believe that? No. Okay. And do we think that's like proper Bible, or is that Bible fanfic? So that's the Catholics. there's a split around 10th or 11th century, and it kind of splits off to like Catholic and Greek Orthodox, and then obviously how Protestantism comes about with your boy Martin Luther.
He
and then
has
from
a list.
there
He's checking it twice. He's putting up on the cathedral doors. He knows.
So it all kind of spreads out from there, and then it's like roughly every generation, there's kind of somebody who comes along and says, no, you guys are doing it wrong. This is how we should be. This is how we should be celebrating God or telling the gospel. And from there, from within Protestantism, you get your Methodists, your Baptists, your Evangelicals, your Pentecostals, and so on and so forth. And I think because Protestantism, at least in the UK, starts with a split from an organised, in a way that kind of normalises it.
I would agree with that to an extent. The Reformation, on it, the whole basis of was, here's the stuff, you make the decision for yourself. You interpret this how you think it should be interpreted. And I think that absolutely invites, and you're going to disagree. I mean, even, I think if you maybe even put two Catholics in the same room and went, right, interpret this for me, they might come up with something different each time.
Well, if you asked 100 people about Jesus, you'd get 100 different answers. And that's part of the beauty and also part of the frustration of it. But the point I'm trying to get at with a lot of these televangelists are non-denominational, so it means they don't ascribe to a particular type of Christianity, but it also often means they don't have much in the way of like any kind of central oversight like you might find in the Catholic Church or the Church of England. There's nobody to kind of tap them on the shoulder and be like, oh, I'm sorry, Kenneth, you went over the line there. You shouldn't have done that. But broadly speaking, if we're looking for a style, they come under the label of evangelicals, okay? Now, there's a specific denomination of evangelical Christians, and there's also just a broader description of evangelicals. I fit into that kind of broader description, and it's a style or like a type of theology that can sort of be traced back to your boy Martin Luther, but really starts to be your G, but really starts to codify much later in about, I think, 1738 with preachers like John Wesley. So
yes,
typically speaking, a church service with evangelical roots tends to be, honestly, like just more exciting than that of some of the high church services. The worship songs tend to be more interesting. The preaching tends to be more engaging. So it's not surprising that this is what translates best to television.
Yeah.
Like in an ecosystem where people can just turn off if they get bored, you really need to be as interesting as possible.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at like evangelicals and politics, this is where it gets really interesting. There's something really interesting going on there. So there's different models of salvation, different ways of seeing what it is to be a Christian and what it is to be the church in the modern world. And coming back to like the black preachers preaching on vinyl, what tended to do better was the sermons that were about personal morality, and the political sermons tended to kind of get a bit sort of pushed aside, which is not hugely surprising considering that they would have been railing against things like segregation and so on. It's not a massive surprise that kind of gets nudged to the side. And in addition to this, many churches in the United States have like a tax exempt status.
Yes, yeah, I think
now
if that's the same here as well. But I know, I have heard in America that it is. Yeah, there's interesting tax things going on.
Now, if we look at this with the nice, this is how this was intended to be way, they don't pay tax on a lot of their income. And the reason for that is that in some cases, the church is effectively filling in a gap that the state would have to fill in otherwise. Yeah. So, for example, if you're running a soup kitchen or youth programs or outreach programs for people on the streets, it makes sense that you would want to make life as easy as possible for those guys. And by having this, but the thing that happens is there's not a whole heap of regulation in terms of this. It's not like anyone's coming around and sort of checking and saying, okay, how much have you actually helped society? Yes, I get that you preach the gospel. Good job. Well done. But have you actually helped your community in any way? Also, by having this tax-exempt status, that often meant you can't be overtly political or being critical of the government, because then you're more like a political advocacy group rather than a sort of charity or rather than a church. So we get this push back to, again, as we say, like personal morality being the main focus of this. And the reason why this tends to be embraced is if you can effectively tell someone that their struggles in life come from their own personal moral failings, that means there's no need to change the structures in society that disadvantage the poor or oppressed minorities. So, I mean, so that's how it should be. Like church and state, two completely separate things.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll give you a bit of a tax break, but just stay out of politics and just do good things. Can you do that right? Obviously, this separation of church and state doesn't really work very well, because politicians are usually eager for any support they can get to motivate their base to vote for them. So what we start to see is that these evangelicals often support any government that wants to maintain the social status quo and or demonize any minorities that could be seen as a threat. So in the 1930s, you get a radio evangelist who's like a Roman Catholic priest called Father Charles Coughlin, who has like a strong anti-communist and just slightly anti-Semitic radio programs that reach millions of listeners, you know? If we fast forward to the 1970s and the 1980s, we start to see our Dolores Umbridge character, Jerry Falwell, and his moral majority, which are courted by Republican candidates like Reagan, which we see in the film. And they're both essentially preaching the same thing. You can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps or with help from God, but what you definitely don't need is a government handout. We don't need that at all. You're fine, you know? This then leads us into the style of theology that we see at play here, which is often referred to as the prosperity gospel. Now, I know you do research like nobody's business, so I know you came across this a little bit.
I do a little here and there.
So what does the prosperity gospel mean to you?
So from my understanding, a prosperity gospel is the idea that God, if you ask God for something, and it can, our wonderful expert mentioned, and it can be something like a Ferrari, and God will grant it to you. When I first heard about it, what I sort of hoped for, and indeed when I was listening to Jim Bakker in the film sort of say what prosperity gospel is, at first it seems to make sense, because I feel like, look, as an outside observer, God wouldn't want you to suffer. You know what I mean? I think especially in today's late stage capitalist society, money is pretty important to exist. Speaking as somebody who might own a house, maybe, if I work really hard.
If you stop eating all that avocado toast.
Look, man, avocados are good. If the prosperity gospel worked in avocados, I would be set for life. But I think I sort of thought of it as a nice idea that, God wants you to be able to sort of afford a house and have basic necessities. And then obviously, as I think with a lot of things, sometimes it just got distorted beyond anything really. And it was more about just, God doesn't want you just to kind of get by and not be comfortable. He wants you to be wealthy. And to do that, you've got to send me money. And I'll make sure that I'll pray for you, or I'll get that in kind. So, I mean, and I think I sent this quote to you from Andrew Garfield, but he was saying how, quote, ultimately, he just misinterpreted the word prosperity in the Bible, because from the original Greek, it meant spiritual prosperity, which, as we know, is kind of the antithesis of material prosperity. But he just happened to miss that little detail and created an empire and a whole movement based on the idea that God wants us to be rich and have nice things, which I think knocks it on the head, really. That quite profound there from Mr. Peter Parker himself, truly understanding that with great power comes great responsibility.
So it's not really surprising that this type of theology really comes to the fore in America, and crucially starts to sort of build momentum during the 1930s, like the Depression era, where you
absolutely ties in with that American dream, go west, find yourself a bit of land,
Yeah.
you expand from there. Absolutely.
100%. It's the belief that God wants to deliver us not just from damnation, but also ill health and, crucially, poverty. Now, how can I put this? There are people who can misquote Bible verses at like an Olympic standard, okay? And the one that always comes out for this kind of thing is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, don't get me wrong. That is a really nice Bible verse. That's the kind of thing where when you're like on a birthday or when you're getting married or whatever, somebody in your church, somebody who you love, somebody who loves you, will write that in your sort of greetings card.
Yeah.
And it'll make you go, oh. It's not enough to build your own personal theology around. You with me?
Yeah.
You know?
mean, the Bible is a huge book. It's a book of
it
books,
is a
right?
huge. I mean, it's. Well, I mean, obviously the word Bible comes from biblio. It's not just a book; it's a freaking library. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think
66 books written by 40 authors over the space of 1,000 years. You know,
I think it's no sort of secret as well that I think the Bible occasionally contradicts itself. But I think that's only if you take sort of Old Testament and New Testament as. I think, people are allowed to change their minds. The Bible should also be allowed to change its mind, right? Just because something was written in Old Testament, it doesn't stick forever, right?
Well, do you know what? It's really interesting you mentioned that, because the important thing to sort of factor in with these things is context, okay? So if I say to my boy Riley, whenever we're near a road, we hold mummy or daddy's hands. We don't walk through a car park. We don't cross the road without holding mummy or daddy's hands. And you never go near a road on your own. Imagine if we have that. If I have that same advice when he's 18.
Yeah.
He'll never flipping leave the house. God told people things that they needed to hear at a certain time.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that are forever and always, and there are certain things that only work in a specific context. And the thing that's really difficult, the thing that we spend our lives pinging back and forth, is trying to work out the discernment to work out what's
which ones are which. Yeah,
exactly. And this is the thing, right? We get, as Christians, we've got the Bible to look at. We've got each other to sort of talk to and sort of thrash ideas out. And we've got our own personal discernment. And the idea is that if you're really chasing God, if you're really trying to be the best follower of Christ you can be, that your judgment will improve gradually as you go along. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, things evolve, and even everyone's allowed to change their mind about something.
100%,
nothing's set in stone.
Well, okay. Some things are set in stone.
Just
broadly,
10 things are set in stone. The rest
broadly
of it.
speaking, it's like Jesus is real. Jesus was the Son of God. He died to save our sins. He came back, and God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are all kind of the one thing. Those are maybe the 5 things that for me I would say are like non-negotiables.
I absolutely, I think Jesus was a real person.
Yeah.
I maybe not, the jury's out maybe on if I think he was the Son of God. But I think you don't, the same way that I think King Arthur was very popular, and there is some, not much I don't think, but some scholarly thought that King Arthur was real. But he was like a Saxon.
Are you thinking about Nennius? Soldier.
Very possibly. But I feel like you don't get all of these. Oh,
sorry, go on. Did you know the first reference to King Arthur, it comes from like a 6th century monk called Nennius, who says, he's talking about some other dude, and he says, and although he was no Arthur, he slew 400 men.
Yeah.
And do you know where that was written?
Where was that written?
Bangor.
Oh,
Kid you not, right?
amazing. Oh,
Like one of
that's
the
the best
one of the first
What a place.
pieces of Arthurian literature came from Wales's first city, the centre of the known universe. Hey guys, it's Editing Giles here. So, past Giles made a few mistakes and conflated one or two things about Arthurian literature and the study of it. And in my defence, I was going on based on a lecture from 20 years previous, so give me a break. So, the oldest source of all doesn't actually name Arthur, but it names what others later said was Arthur's most famous battle, the Battle of Badon, which was normally dated around 492. And then the second is a Welsh poem from just after AD 600, which praised a Celtic warrior who had been killed in an important battle by saying that, although he was not Arthur, he had slain many enemies on the ramparts of his fortress. Then the third item is a history written by Nennius in the monastery in Bangor, the one which becomes Bangor Cathedral about AD 790, which is the first known attempt at a comprehensive story of Arthur. Special thanks to Lizzie Boothroyd and Professor Peter Field for helping me clear that up. I appreciate most of you guys are not Arthurian nerds, but I wouldn't have been happy letting myself just make mistakes like that, so I wanted to correct it. Back to the show. Anyway.
But
this is another podcast for another time.
I feel like you don't get, and especially if you look at the Bible, I feel like you don't get these stories and these tales and these accounts have to come from somewhere, right? Surely there must be one defining event or one defining person that sparked all of this. So I think it's more than plausible that Jesus was a real person.
Yeah.
It's, for me, I'm maybe not so certain on him being the Son of God.
Well, we got plenty of time to try and change your mind.
We got time. I don't know. Next season it could be a Christian and a Christian. Let's discuss it. No, you never know.
You never know. Listen, the best thing is, it's not my job to convince you. I just have to tell you about this stuff. Jesus doesn't go around saying like, listen, you got to just keep going at them until they finally give in. He's just like, dude, just tell them about me. And then just move on, and then it's up to them, and it really takes the weight off my... Anyway, talking about Jesus, because you knew he was going to come up at some point.
Big JC, he's got a...
Big old JC, yeah. There's this line in, I want to say Mark 10, 29-30. He says, truly I tell you, Jesus replied, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mothers or fathers or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. So that is, if I was trying to make an argument for the prosperity gospel, I would be saying, look, Jesus himself says, if you give something away, you'll get it back 100-fold back, okay? And that's fine if it's not for the fact that comes from a whole section where Jesus has just been speaking to a rich man who says, Lord, what do I need to do to follow you? And Jesus says, sell everything you've got and come and follow me. And the dude goes back absolutely deflated because he just can't do it. Jesus says this bit where he says, truly, I tell you, it would be easier to fit a camel through the eye of a needle than it would for a rich man to sort of enter into the kingdom of heaven. And
listen up, Jeff Bezos. Sell your stuff. Elon, if you want to sell your stuff. Sell all the Teslas.
Yeah. So again, it's this idea that being rich is probably going to be one of the biggest barriers to following God that you're ever going to get. And you end up with this kind of view of God as like this kind of cupboard love thing. I love you, you give me stuff.
Like
now, my friend Robert Helms had a really good line. He said, if God gave us everything we wanted, we'd be walking by sight and not by faith. We'd never have our faith tested, and we'd never learn to depend on God. And that worked. You know how sometimes things just coalesce beautifully? Because my friend Natalie Miniker of this parish told me about the concept of epistemic distance. It's the idea that God makes his existence deliberately unprovable and ambiguous so that we're able to act with true morality. A moral action that's performed only to impress a noble and provable deity would be corrupt in nature. Basically, the idea that morality is what we do when no one is watching.
Yeah.
It's the idea that if this was what it was like, then do you really believe in God, or are you just trying to please your boss?
Yeah.
It's really difficult because it's not just about wealth. If it was just about wealth and sort of wants to get rich, that would be one thing. But also another aspect is healing. This can mean that there are some particularly vulnerable people who get sucked into this kind of ministry because conventional medicine doesn't have any answers for them. And it's really easy, if you wanted, to look at how gullible they are for believing in this kind of thing. But when you are dealing with like chronic illness, you really are willing to try just about anything. And I think one of the things about televangelists is that they're so far removed from the people that they're usually talking to that they don't get to see the harm that's happening to people by donating so religiously to their ministries. God doesn't want you to give so much that you end up being in financial trouble. And I believe that God can heal people. I've obviously had a long-term injury going back to my childhood. And so obviously I believe he can heal people, but I also know that he doesn't always do that. And just because he doesn't heal you doesn't mean that there's no God, or doesn't mean he isn't sovereign. And I think I've talked about this in the past. For Christians, our relationship with God isn't transactional. I'm not in it for what I can get out of him. I was trying to think of a good comparison, and I was thinking, like, imagine you've just had a long day at work. It's not been 5 kids who are great and 1 kid who is horrible. It's been 10 kids who are horrible, and like your bosses are on your back as well. You come home and your fiance has just made you the most delicious, amazing meal. They've drawn you a bath and given you a book and just said, you know, like, you give me, if there's anything you need, give me a shout. And you're like,
if you're listening, Dan, take notes.
You're just like, oh my gosh, I love you so much. And then you have another day where it's a really tough day and it's horrible, and you come home and your fiance has done none of that. He's just sat on the sofa, been zonked out. And does it change how you feel about them? Are you like, okay, well, my dinner's not on the table, so I don't love you anymore?
Yeah, that would be ridiculous. I think that's a really good analogy, actually, that I think that sort of makes sense. You love unconditionally, right? And you know that even though in this imaginary scenario, which has never happened, even though my lovely fiance hasn't cooked me dinner and has sat on the sofa all day, he doesn't love me any less either. Yeah.
Like I say, that's the best way I can put it. And I've said this like probably a million times before. It's not, for me, it's not really a religion. It's a relationship. And if this person can stand by me even when I let him down consistently, it would be disingenuous for me to give up on him when he doesn't give me something that I need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that I know. I mean, I suppose in a way he's got a lot of people that he would need to theoretically cook dinner for. I know Jesus fed 5,000 people with like 5 loaves of bread and like 5 fish. So I don't know, maybe if you got Jesus to do some of the cooking, he could make it, right? Is it Bruce Almighty where Jim Carrey becomes God for a bit and he says yes to every single prayer that he gets? Yeah. And then it's something ridiculous with the lottery where like it's a 20 million pool and like 20 million people win, so they all just get £1. It would be kind of like that, right? If God said yes to everything all the time, would that actually really be beneficial for everybody all the time?
Exactly. Maybe? Yeah. I think we're going to end that section there because I don't think we can do any better. The last thing I wanted to talk about was Tammy Faye's interview with Steve Peters. So this is in the film, but it's in there for such a short period of time, and it really needs to be unpacked. So in 1985, Tammy Faye Bakker interviews AIDS activist and gay man and pastor Steve Peters on the PTL show Tammy's House Party. Now, like, Tammy's House Party isn't the serious main thing. It's not the main prestige thing. It's just, we'll just give our own little talk show just she can talk to whoever she wants, just keep her happy, whatever. And Steve talks about his life as a gay man and his own battle with AIDS, and he discusses his many AIDS-related illness, including cancer, and also discusses turning to his faith in God to help him pull through. Now, I sent you the original footage of the interview of this, didn't you? What did you think of that?
Yeah. I didn't think it would kind of get to me, but I think it was quite a, what's the word? Not jovial is maybe the wrong word, but it was quite a sort of light-hearted interview.
Yeah.
Up until it wasn't, and it's when Steve is talking about basically his near-death experience that he had 2 weeks before he was speaking, and that just bit of a lump in my throat thinking about it now. That whole thing where he was discussing praying to God and feeling a peace and sort of preparing to die, which, my God, just absolutely it's something that you don't think about, I think, in sort of your day-to-day life, sort of.
Yeah.
Especially us young'uns, you and I, you don't put, at least I don't, you don't put a lot of thought into dying, and to have someone speak so candidly, I think.
Yeah. Maybe this is just me, but certainly when I became a parent, I kept thinking about dying all the damn time. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, okay, if I die, this happens. If I did this and that and all the other. So it's, I think.
But even then, maybe it's sort of the aftermath, right? What happens when I'm gone? Who picks up the pieces? Where does my stuff go? Who gets all my incredible coats?
Yeah, I've spent time thinking about this. I've come up with a system. It's fine.
But just to speak so candidly about that was, it was quite a lot.
Now, did you know, in her introduction, she tells a little lie there, because she says that he couldn't be with them in the studio because he was in LA, they were in South Carolina, and it would put his body through too much to thing. Originally, the plan was to have him come in and be interviewed in person. Yeah. That was the plan. But none of her crew were willing to be in the same room as somebody as an AIDS patient.
I read an article that Steve Peters wrote after the film came out, where I mentioned something about basically, the sort of the studio pulled out at the last minute and left him a bit high and dry, which is...
So they do the sort of studio link up, and you can tell as he's fiddling with his earpiece, neither of them are used to it. It's a little out of their budget normally. So what I thought was really interesting in that was just Tammy's the view of how her model of what Christianity should be is brilliant. She says a young man who had AIDS, and she talks about how his own parents were afraid to touch him and his sister was too afraid to touch him. To think that I might never again have a hug, and how sad that we as Christians who are to be the salt of the earth, we who are supposed to be able to love everyone, are afraid so badly of an AIDS patient that we'll not go up and put an arm around them and tell them that we care. And you can hear her breaking up as she...
oh, bless her. I think she is, if she isn't already crying, then she is close, because bless her, she is just so overcome with emotion. You can really tell.
Yeah, and I love the way her idea is that as a Christian, you should be the gold standard when it comes to kindness. Because that's obviously you should, it should be, you should be able to, people should be able to see Christ in everything you do because you are radically kind and this sort of thing. What's really important here. And also I thought what was fun was we see this great example of a very specific kind of allyship, So I don't know if you've ever sort of seen this or felt this, but what we often see is like a reluctance on the part of allies to speak for a minority. Now, in a sense, that's a good thing, because you should obviously give minorities the room to speak for themselves. And we do see Tammy Faye doing that here. She kind of gives him lots of space to do that. But what it overlooks is that often it's the audience, not the speaker, that's important. Okay? And what I mean by that is, I once heard someone say that something to the effect of, the best person to explain the problems minorities face to straight white dudes are often other straight white dudes.
I think sometimes, especially people who, even if they aren't aware that they hold such an unconscious bias, I think if they had a person of colour kind of sit and explain to them Y and Z about some piece of oppression that is affecting them in that moment, they would be more likely to kind of, oh, well, it doesn't happen to everybody, and sort of explain their way out of it. Whereas if you have someone who is of their kind of club, I suppose, right, they feel their unconscious bias is not biasing, and they're more inclined to accept that as fact.
Absolutely, 100%. So Tammy Faye kind of asked these questions that 21st century ears sound basic to the point of insulting. Do you remember that bit where she's like,
yeah, there are a few...
Have you ever kissed a woman? And he's like, well, I've kind of necked a girl. Are you sure you just haven't given a woman a good try? That was
a few of them. I think if she had Twitter now and she'd written those things on Twitter, in 5 years they're going to get dug up and she'll be cancelled. We know.
But it was just so funny because she has a little bit of a giggle in her voice as well. Yeah, she's just like, she knows. She feels embarrassed asking these questions, but she kind of knows that it's the kind of questions her audience would be asking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it comes from a place of wanting to genuinely understand rather than from a place of wanting to belittle or embarrass, right? It's genuinely, I'm not quite sure how this works, please explain it to me.
And you can feel that, can't you, when somebody's on your side versus when somebody's looking for a chink in your armour. Like those dudes on Twitter who say, genuine question, why do women think that they're not equal? I mean, like, I don't feel like this is a genuine question, you know?
Like, I don't know whether to call it a meme or sort of a one-panel comic, but I don't know if you've seen it, but it's one that comes up, it's a peasant. Very sort of Monty Python-esque peasant, looking very sad and very kind of emaciated. And he goes, I think we maybe should change society somewhat. And then the next panel is this sort of straight white male popping out of well, going, yet you participate in society. How curious. I'm asking a genuine question. Do you know what I mean? But the walrus is another one of this kind of, oh, well, I'm asking a genuine question. But
yeah, we politely invite those guys to just get in the bin. So anyway, those questions that Tammy Faye asks are perfectly calibrated to that predominantly white, evangelical, middle-class America audience that she's speaking to. And yes, it is a bit cringe, but it's perfect.
Yeah, I think looking at it with our modern sensibilities, and we understand so much more now about the gay community. They have much more of a voice, much more of a platform to express things that we know now. To turn around to a gay man and go, oh, well, have you not tried the white woman? Is not quite the way to go. But 40 years ago, it's understandable.
And I've talked about my position on homosexuality and the kind of the journey I went on to get to the point where I'm at now in earlier episodes. And if you want to check those out, you can find them. But one thing I keep thinking is that when you die and get to heaven, God will be like, hey, how you doing? Nice to see you. Sit yourself down. Do you want a tea or coffee or anything? Okay, you're good. Now, when it comes to your theology, you were right about this bit and this bit, but on this bit, you were a bit confused, okay? Now, it is entirely possible that I could be wrong about my pro-LGBTQ stance. And if I am, then I believe Jesus will tell me and he'll sit it down and explain to me. But what I don't want him to say is that I didn't love people enough. He was abundantly clear on that bit. That bit was, there was no ambiguity. Now, if anyone is listening to this with more traditional views who thinks it's unfair that I'm accusing them of not being loving, they might say things like, we do love gay people, but we don't agree with their lifestyle, or we're accepting of gay people in our church, but we don't believe they should be in any positions of leadership. I mean, you can think that if you want, you guys, but all that is segregation with a modern twist. And I don't believe that Jesus had time for that nonsense.
No, absolutely. It's more steps. Again, it's not a lifestyle. I think to phrase it as a lifestyle, speaking as someone who is bisexual, but I didn't figure this out until quite a while into my life. I don't live my daily life going, right, okay, well, as a bisexual, how should I do this precisely from a bisexual point of view? I just go out and buy my groceries, you know what I mean? It's not.
Yeah, but you bought them bisexually.
Oh, I mean, I did.
You were thinking about Gillian Anderson while you were doing it.
Who isn't thinking of Gillian Anderson, to be quite honest, man?
That meme, like from the two sort of bicep muscles, like come together, and it's like straight dudes, gay women, and the hand is just Gillian Anderson in the middle there.
I mean, did you see her in Hannibal? Oh, that's a podcast.
Yeah,
that's a podcast.
So anyway, this interview with Steve Peters, the parallels with Jesus here are painfully obvious. In the 80s, AIDS victims are literally treated like lepers. There's no real understanding of exactly how this untreatable disease was transferred, so people don't want to be anywhere at all around anyone with HIV or AIDS. And to an extent, after having remembering what the early days of COVID were like, I can almost sympathise with that, that sense of like... that kind of panic. And additionally, the fact that this hit the gay community first meant that some of the more homophobic parts of Christian culture had taken to seeing it as God's judgment in some way, shape or form. Now, like I said, we talked about that in the past. Jesus says literally nothing about homosexuality, and much of people's opinions about it come from either the Old Testament or the writings of St. Paul. So, if you're ever unsure about what Jesus thinks about a subject, then the only thing you can do is look at what Jesus did in these kind of situations. And time again, Jesus is consistently going to the poor, marginalised and oppressed, whether it's the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, Jesus and Zacchaeus the tax collector in Luke 19, Jesus and the leper in Matthew 8, Jesus and the thief on the cross in Luke 23. His last act before dying practically is to comfort someone who is at the absolute margins of society. Basically, if Jesus were alive today, don't even bother trying to book him to speak at your church, because he's not going to show up. If he was in Manchester, you wouldn't find him in church for very long. He'd be on Canal Street handing out bottles of water to clubbers and letting people tell him about their problems. And the older I get, the more I realise that the most important thing to do is love people first, and the rest is just details. It's literally our whole thing to love people the way Jesus would love them, because if we don't, they'll go and find that love somewhere else, and we can't always guarantee that love will come from the healthiest of sources.
There's a quote I saw, and it was, those who aren't fed love on spoons will learn to lick it from knives. Which I think is a fantastic quote. It's just the rawest thing you've ever heard. I might have come across it on Pinterest, to be truly honest with you, so I don't know where she is now. But I read that, and it absolutely was seared into my brain rent-free. It's just such a raw quote.
And that's how I feel, particularly having kids myself now. This is no longer a theoretical argument for me. This is like, if my kids are gay, I want my church to be somewhere where they're going to feel welcome, where they're going to feel loved and accepted for who they are, not we love you but, we love you and, this sort of thing. The last thing I'm going to finish on is a quote from Tammy Faye, where she said, when we lost everything, it was the gay people that came to my rescue, and I will always love them for that. And I thought that was beautiful. Last person you would associate with a televangelist would be somebody like RuPaul.
Yeah, I was watching an interview that she did on the RuPaul show, because it was on my recommended after I watched the Stephen Peters interview. And she comes down on sort of a little runway, and she drops a coat and shows off her suit, and RuPaul is living. And they're literally just sat chatting like sisters almost. So who did the coat, who did the suit? And Tammy Faye's going, I got them in Chinatown for $60, and RuPaul going, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And it was just such a wonderful kind of relationship between the two. It was really heartwarming to watch.
People will go where they're loved, and if you're a representative of Jesus, you're meant to be the gold standard of loving. Okay, that wraps up Finding the Faith in the Film. I've had so much fun in this episode, Julia.
This has been juicy. I've had so much fun.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, ladies and gents. Please join us for our next episode, which is going to be on the Fabelmans, and we hope to see you soon. Julia, have you had a good time?
I've had an amazing time.
Yeah, me too. Okay, we'll see you soon, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Waffle editing by
Natalie Minaker.
Please rate and review.
Unless it's a 1-star, in which case, simply call 0800 24601, where one of our experienced operators will hear your negative review for the small processing fee of £10. Once your donation has been processed, Giles will hear your review and pray for you to change your mind.